high school Sunday school teacher at Crossgates United Methodist Church. These are our pandemic Sunday schools. We're going to wrap up the book of Judges today. So if you're going backwards and thinking about it, I'm pretty sure this is our 7th video. We had a few on introduction to the Bible and the biblical timeline, and then we've done a series on Judges. Haven't hit everything that's in Judges, but we're going to wrap it up today talking about the story of Samson. And I got to tell you, from the very get-go, when I actually have students in this classroom, I try to make sure they understand that what is important is what they get out of their personal reading of the Bible. I want them to listen to what I say. I want them to listen to what our pastor says, and then I want them to think for themselves. So this is one of those stories. This is difficult to teach. This is to me a very dark story from a dark period in the Bible. So what I want to emphasize to you, that especially today, maybe more than other times, as I read various commentaries, you get so many different views of the story of Samson. So I'm going to bring to you basically kind of a synopsis of some of the things that I've read that other greater minds have said. But what you need to do, whether you're a high school student, a middle school student, or an adult, is read this story for yourself and pull out of it what you pull out of it. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to look at Judges chapters 13 through 16. This story is over 4 chapters of the Bible. So look at Judges chapters 13 through 16. Take your time with it. Read it for yourself. You know, look, you might not want to read all this in one day. You can come back. This is a video, right? You come back 3 days, 4 days, next week. But read it for yourself, and then after you've done that, come back to the video. And in the video, we're going to focus just on chapter 16 to try to keep it a reasonable size. So at this point, I'll just let you go and do that, and I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay. Hopefully you've read Judges 13 through 16, and I wish you were here so that I could see your faces and so that I could get some range of reaction to the story of Samson, because you know, this is just one of those where if you're teaching any group of people at any age, I think you're going to get a variety of reactions. I have written a short outline up here just to try to keep me on track, right? Because like I said, we're really going to focus on that last chapter, on chapter 16. This is one of the stories that you might have encountered if you grew up in church when you were, you know, what I call an itty bitty, when you were in elementary school and you had the nice, you know, painted pictures of biblical characters, and you know, Samson is the strong man. So he's one of the people that we grow up thinking of him being this huge, strong character. God gave him physical abilities, and he could do anything he needed to do on the physical side of things, and wasn't that wonderful? And see, this is what God can do for you and how God can help you. Then you read the story when you're older, and you come back, if you're me, right? You come back and you say, wow, this was a dark time. The entire book of Judges, to me, as I study Old Testament history, seems to be like a dark ages for the nation of Israel, for the people of Israel. You don't have a king. You don't have a united government, a united front to show against the other nations in a military fashion. So there are these constant invasions by Canaanites, by Philistines, by Moabites, you know, Ammonites, just all these different people, as just happened in that part of his history. You don't seem to have a central theological institution. You know, you don't have specific places where people go worship. You don't even seem to have a specific code that you follow in how you worship God. To me, those things really seem to be developing. You don't have a strong prophetic presence like you will later with Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Micah, and others. So you really don't have, you think about the Old Testament, and what I was taught, and I think it makes sense, is there were kind of three pillars to the community in the Old Testament: the prophets, the priests, and the kings. And we have a hymn we sing in church sometimes if you go to a traditional service: prophet and priest and king, because on this side of the cross, we as Christians see Jesus as being a combination of those three things: prophet and priest and king. But in the book of Judges, you don't have a strong presence for either of the any of those, prophet or priest or king. You see the judges kind of like prophets, being raised up by God to handle a particular invasion usually, but the people are like this. The people call on God when they need God, and then they quickly forget. They call on God, then they quickly forget. So it, to me, is a dark time during the history, kind of a dark ages. And a benighted people. Now this could be our ACT word of the day, benighted. It just means kind of like bumping around in the dark, okay? Benighted. You're in nighttime, you don't have lights, you don't have guiding lights, you don't have guidance. These people, and especially during the story of Samson, we seem to have a very benighted people. They in two ways. One is they're governed by the Philistines. They have, the Bible tells us, and this is in chapter 13, once again, they have done evil in the sight of the Lord. So God has allowed the Philistines to come in and take over the territory and really be their governors. The Philistines were a sea people, one of what a lot of the scholars call the sea peoples, capital S, capital P, as a actual culture. Came in probably across the Mediterranean from the Aegean Sea area, came across, landed on the coast, and were pushing their way up into the areas where the Israelites lived, and had actually taken over most of those areas during the time of Samson. So they were being, and you will notice that the Bible calls them the uncircumcised, which, of course, in the Old Testament is just a way of saying these people didn't know God, basically, and didn't follow any rules according to the worship of Yahweh, of Jehovah God. So they were being governed by what they would consider to be an ungodly people, and the people themselves seem to be unrepentant. So follow me here. In most of the stories in the book of Judges, what happens is the people have done evil in the sight of the Lord, and then a foreign entity like the Philistines has come and taken over. And then the people repent. The people call on the name of God for salvation, for physical, actual, governmental salvation. God, please come help us. We've done wrong. We will do better. We'll knock down the idols. We'll stop worshiping other gods, making sacrifices to them, and we'll focus on you and the Ten Commandments. That second part never happens in the book of in the story of Samson. So you've got the part about the people doing evil in the sight of the Lord. You've got the part about the Philistines coming and God letting the Philistines come and take over. But you never have the part where the people turn back to God, where the people repent. Of course, that's basically what repent means, is turn back. Where the people call on God for a physical or a moral salvation. So what you've got in the story of Samson is this dark time, and like I say, a benighted people, a people who are not even trying, it doesn't seem like, to get back to a good relationship with God. So what kind of story do you get? Well, you get the story of Samson. So go to point 2 here. You get a really strange hero. There are a lot of heroes in the Old Testament, and I love reading in Hebrews, the other end of the Bible, where you have chapter 11 and some of the other chapters around there of Hebrews, where it goes through the Old Testament heroes and what they taught us and how they really set us up for thinking about Christ and understanding the works of Christ. But in Samson, let's think about this a little bit. And again, I'm hoping that you've read the whole story, right? Because there's a lot that goes on. There are a lot of women involved. And, I read this and thinking to myself that this is like a very, very early version of a James Bond film. It seems like there's a different woman in every scene. The hero, Samson, is almost purely a physical hero. His miracles, if you want to call them miracles, when he kills 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass, a donkey, or when he pulls up the entire gate of a city and carries it several miles away to show his strength. This is strength that God gave him. The story is very clearly on this. But with Samson, his hero capabilities seem to be almost physical. So in his life, what's he doing? He's doing these miracles that are physical miracles. The story never really talks about Samson preaching about God, teaching about God, being a prophet. It says that he led Israel for 20 years, but it doesn't give us any information about him really being what we would think of as a prophet or a real judge, other than in that physical way. The involvement with the three women, there are a lot of threes in this story, but the involvement in particular with the three women who are in the story. His hair, now let's get into that. His entire relationship with God, and there are some prayers from Samson, so I don't want to sell him too short, but if you think about his relationship, it seems to be all tied to the fact that a vow was taken for him by his parents, really. Even before he was born, that he would be a Nazarite. Now, the Nazarite vows, Nazarite is a word that basically means separated. Interestingly enough, you think about that really as being part of the Pharisees' etymology as well. But the Nazarites, at least by the time the book of Numbers was written, and if you look at Numbers chapter 6, it talks about the Nazarite vows. And there were a few things that a Nazarite was supposed to do. Usually it was a vow for only part of your life, whereas with Samson, which seems to be an earlier version of this, it was lifelong. So that's different and kind of hard to keep any vow, for your entire life, especially something like not cutting your hair. But the Nazarites were not supposed to cut their hair. No razor was supposed to come near their head. They weren't supposed to drink wine or any intoxicating liquor, or even eat grapes, or I don't know what it says, grapes or anything that comes from a vineyard. So even a non-alcoholic version of grape juice, they weren't supposed to drink, and they weren't supposed to. And this is the Numbers chapter 6. They weren't supposed to be around dead people or unclean objects like dead people. And there in Numbers 6, there's even a kind of an escape clause for what you do if you're standing beside somebody and they all of a sudden die, which I think is kind of funny. But not that they die, but that there is an escape clause. The way that the Nazarite could go back and cleanse themselves. So if you click over to Samson then, which again I say seems to be an earlier version of making these vows, the only thing that Samson seems to pay attention to is the hair. He's around dead bodies all the time because he's either killing people, Philistines, or if you think about when he scoops the honey, one of the earlier chapters, he scoops the honey out of the carcass of the lion. He has killed this lion, and weeks later bees have come in and they've actually developed a honeycomb. Well, you weren't supposed to do that if you're a Nazarite. You weren't supposed to be around dead stuff, particularly dead people, but it probably also passed on to dead animals, maybe unless you were cooking. So the hair is really the only part of the Nazarite vow that seems to be applying to Samson for some reason. And his relationship with God, as we see, seems to be so connected to this physical vow. And of course, when his hair is cut, he loses his strength, the strength that has been coming from God. So, a very strange hero, an almost purely physical hero. Think about this. Even in the book of Judges, we think of the other heroes, some of the other heroes in the book of Judges, and later in the Old Testament. We think about Hebrew Israelite war leaders often winning the battles not because they had great individual physical strength or not because they had outnumbered the opponents, but because God gives them special powers, and those powers often have to do with cleverness, guile, the King James Version would probably say. So think about Gideon. Gideon ends up defeating that whole army with 300 people. God doesn't want him going down with the 22,000 or the 10,000 or all the people that he's gathered. God narrows it down to 300 so that everybody will know that this victory was God's doing, not Gideon's doing. Well, where is that type of teaching in the story of Samson and in having a hero like Samson? I'll tell you that I read one commentator, I thought this was really interesting, who said that even the person who pulled together the book of Judges, so I think most people would call that the Deuteronomist, if you're keeping score on where the sources all come from. But even the person who pulled together the book of these stories of Judges centuries after they really became stories or happened, even that person couldn't seem to find a theological or a godly way to talk about this story. So he just tells the story pretty much without comment. He doesn't really bolster Samson and say that Samson was a wonderful person or say that Samson was a horrible person. He just puts the story in there, probably because it was so important to the people of Israel as a folk hero story. It was to the people of Israel an important part of their history and something they were proud of, that they had this big strong guy who could kill a bunch of Philistines. But as a theological story, it's challenging to read and it's challenging to teach. As Trey Jones, our pastor, actually just told me in the hall, but I've heard him certainly say this before, there are a lot of people in the Bible that you don't want your children to act like. Very good point. And I think Samson's one of those, in most cases, not in all cases. So let's just look very quickly at chapter 16. And I hope you've read this before. This is the part of the story that you've probably heard even in maybe elementary school, Sunday school. Now Samson, I'm in chapter 16. Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. And when it was told to the Gazites, saying, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. And they kept silent all night, saying, let us wait till the morning light, then we will kill him. Now Samson lay until midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the city gate and the two posts and pulled them up along with the bars, obviously a feat of extreme physical strength. Then he put them on his shoulders, the doors, the gate posts, and carried them up to the top of the mountain, which is opposite Hebron. Now it came about after that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Commentators like to point out that of the three women, this is the only one that the Bible says he loved. So there seems to have been much more emotional attachment, at least in this episode. The lords of the Philistines came up to her, to Delilah. We don't know whether Delilah was a Philistine woman or not. The commentators sort of argue about this. She lived in an area where she could very well have been a Philistine woman, but it doesn't say that she was a Philistine, so we just really don't know. Verse 5, the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him, and see where his great strength lies, and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Now there were five principal Philistine cities. So if you think about 5 lords, 5 times this 1,100, that was a tremendous amount of money at the time. So Delilah agrees to do that. Verse 6. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength is, and how you may be bound to afflict you. Now, why would your lover ask you that? Why would your wife even friend ask you that? How could somebody really tie you up so that they could start to torture you? And that word afflict probably does mean torture. It certainly seems to have, the Hebrew scholars say, has that element of torture in it. Why would somebody even ask you that? And if you're Samson, aren't you at that point going, all right, this is weird. You know, this woman is out for something other than just loving me. Verse 7, Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, then I will become weak and be like any other man. And those cords may have been like plated leather. Some translations say bowstrings. But anyway, some type of new, fresh, strong cord. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh cords that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in wait in an inner room, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the cords as a string of tow snaps when it touches fire, so his strength was not discovered. And of course, she ends up doing this 2 more times, and each of the 3 times, Samson has lied to her and is able to just break the cords, and it seems to be some type of game that Samson is playing with Delilah. But then for the 4th time, Delilah really kind of pulls out all the stops and starts to say, look, if you love me, you'll tell me. So this is verse 17. Sorry, let's start with verse 15. Then she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have deceived me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength is. It came about when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death. So he told her all that was in his heart and said to her, a razor has never come on my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man. When Delilah saw that he had told her all that was in his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up once more, for he has told me all that is in his heart. Then the lord of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She made him sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his hair. Then she began to afflict him, and his strength left him. She said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, well, I'll just go out as other times and shake myself free. He did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. And they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze chains. And he was a grinder in the prison. Okay, so that connection of the physical, of the hair, and that seeming to be Samson's only real connection with God, and that when that was gone, the strength left him, and that the Lord departed him. That there wasn't anything deeper in Samson than that tie. You know, I follow this one rule and I'm good. But look at verse 22. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it was shaved off. Now the lords of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. For they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has given our enemy into our hands, even the destroyer of our country, who has slain many of us. And it so happened when they were in high spirits that they said, call for Samson, that he may amuse us. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he entertained them. They made him dance. They maybe treated him like they treated Jesus before the crucifixion. They maybe, tell me who's hitting you. Because, of course, he had his eyes gouged out, Samson, and was blind. They made him stand between the pillars. Then Samson said to the boy who was holding his hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, and about 3,000 men and women were on the roof looking on, while Samson was abusing them. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested and braced himself against them, the one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bent with all his might so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. Then his brothers and all his father's household came down, took him, brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. Thus he had judged Israel for 20 years. What a weird story. What a dark story. So let's take a few conclusions from it. And thank you for hanging in here with me. Let's think about this as maybe a starting point, maybe a low point, but maybe a starting point in the evolution of how we see our biblical heroes. When I read this story about Samson, I automatically think about David. And I start comparing Samson and the things that we read later in the Bible about David, and how David was a man after God's own heart. He was a warrior. He was a man of blood, which is why he didn't get to build a temple. But the Bible tells us he was a man after God's own heart. Far from perfect, conspiracy to commit murder and all of those things, adultery, the things that happened in David's life, far, far from perfect, but still a warrior, poet, writer, philosopher, theologian, all of those wonderful things that become wrapped into one package when we look at David and the stories of David. So far from just the physical aspects. Yes, he killed Goliath, but how did he do it? Because he was big, strong, huge? No. He did it because he was clever and used that slingshot. Nobody apparently had thought about that before with big old Goliath. But God gives him this idea. He uses the slingshot. God takes him to victory, and then he gives God the glory. One thing that you notice about Samson, especially when he kills the 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of the ass, his prayer or statement after that, look at what I did, doesn't even mention God. So think about an evolution of Samson being this almost purely physical hero to David being so much more than the physical. He was a warrior, was a great warrior, great leader, but so much more than the physical. And then going forward to Christ, who actually defeats the physical limitations of the human condition, right? Both through his miracles and through his own resurrection. So if you just think about that a little bit, as maybe this is a starting point. Maybe we had to have a starting point. But boy, haven't we progressed. And then the second, just quick conclusion here, is that, God can use somebody even like Samson. I mean, Samson did in the end, I suppose, give his life for what was his life's mission of warring against the Philistines. And if you look at Judges 16:22, to me the really nice nugget in this story is that even for somebody of limited abilities like Samson, even for somebody who it doesn't seem like developed a relationship with God, look at what God does after he's captured, after his hair is cut, after he's betrayed by the woman he loves, after his eyes are gouged out. Look at the very next verse in 16:22. But his hair began to grow back. And as his hair grew back, his relationship to God seems to have grown back and perhaps become stronger, perhaps become more meaningful. So even for somebody like Samson, the hair grows back. The faith is still there. God is faithful, which does seem to be very heartfelt. And there is at least purpose in his mind, purpose to his death in the killing of the Philistine lords and ladies. And so he says, and the Bible tells us, he killed even more Philistines in his death than he did in his life. He died. He caused the death of his enemies. But I would loop us back around to the evolution of our idea of a Christian hero, right? And compare that to Christ. And think about how much better it is to die for your enemies than to solely die with your enemies. So, okay, interesting story. Boy, the Old Testament gives us so much to think about. Thanks for being with us during these videos, and if we can be of assistance at Crossgates United Methodist Church, please let us know. We're here to help. God bless you.